in the grand halls of Versailles, where golden mirrors once reflected the glory of absolute monarchy. A different kind of reflection would emerge by 1774, one of decay, corruption, and ultimate human frailty. The man who would become known as Louis the Well-Beloved would die as Louis the Hated, his body consumed not just by disease, but by the very poison of his own reign. This is the story of how a king's moral rot manifested in his physical destruction, and how his putrefying corpse became the perfect symbol of a monarchy already devouring itself from within. The reign of Louis XV stands as one of history's most dramatic reversals of fortuna, cautionary tale about power unchecked and responsibility abandoned. When smallpox finally claimed him in May 1774, it did so with such violent cruelty that even his most loyal servants fled from the stench of his decomposing flesh. But this horrific death was merely the final act in a decades-long tragedy that would set the stage for one of history's most devastating revolutions. To understand the true horror of Louis XV's end, we must first examine how France's most promising young monarch transformed into one of its most despised rulers. His story begins not with the corrupted king gasping for breath in his fetid deathbed, but with a 5-year-old child thrust onto the throne of Europe's most powerful nation. The contrast between these two images, the innocent boy king and the diseased tyrant, reveals the complete moral and physical collapse that would define his reign. The child king of 1715. The year 1715 marked both an ending and a beginning for France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose reign had lasted an unprecedented 72 years, finally succumbed to death. His absolutism had left France both magnificent and exhausted. The richest court in Europe sat atop crushing debt, endless wars, and widespread suffering. His chosen heir, his great-grandson, Louis XV, was only 5 years old. The boy had already lost both parents to disease, making him an orphan before he could even comprehend the weight of kingship. During his minority, the kingdom was governed by a regency under Philippe d'Orléans, a period marked by relative liberalism and modest economic recovery. The young king was raised with the finest education, tutored in languages, mathematics, history, and the arts of war and diplomacy. Reports from his teachers spoke of a sharp intellect, a child who showed promise as a future ruler. France looked upon its boy king with genuine hope. After the long, rigid twilight of Louis XIV's reign, many believed Louis XV could usher in a new golden age. When he officially began ruling in his own right in 1723, he was everything a monarch was expected to be: handsome, intelligent, cultured. The nickname the Well-Beloved was not yet ironic, but heartfelt. Citizens across the nation saw in him a chance for renewal, prosperity, and a more enlightened monarchy. Promise an early prosperity in 1725. Louis married Marie Lasciska, daughter of the deposed King of Poland. Though not the most prestigious match in Europe, the union was celebrated as a diplomatic triumph and a source of stability. The marriage began with affection and quickly produced heirs. Securing the succession, Louis XV also showed genuine interest in the sciences and arts, supporting philosophers, inventors, and artists. Versailles remained the cultural heart of Europe. For a time, it seemed France had found the perfect balance: majesty, tempered with intelligence and promise. Yet, even in these early years, cracks began to show. Louis displayed a troubling tendency toward indecision and an increasing reliance on favorites. Unlike his predecessor, who projected divine authority through personal discipline, Louis XV gravitated toward pleasure. His court developed a reputation for foreshadowing decades of scandal. The War of Austrian Succession. A test failed. The first major test came in 1740 with the War of Austrian Succession. France entered largely to counter British power and support its ally, Prussia. The war dragged on for 8 brutal years, revealing the weaknesses that would plague Louis's reign. Louis personally led troops into battle, earning brief popularity, but his leadership was erratic. Strategy was often driven by court intrigue rather than sound military planning. France spent vast sums, raised taxes, and sank deeper into debt. When the war ended in 1748, with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, most conquered territories were returned, despite enormous sacrifices. The French people were furious. Their sons had died for nothing, their taxes squandered. The once beloved king began to lose the people's trust. Mistresses and scandal by this time. Louis's marriage to Marie Lecesque had grown cold. The king sought comfort in mistresses first, discreetly, then openly. His most famous mistress, Madame de Pompadour, became not only his lover, but his closest advisor. Her influence extended deeply into politics, art, and diplomacy. For the public, this was scandalous. Important offices were filled by her favorites. Royal policy seemed guided by personal passion rather than national interest. Versailles was whispered about not as the center of majesty, but of corruption. Even the construction of the Petit Trianon, a private palace for Madame de Pompadour, symbolized decadence. For a people groaning under taxes and debt, the sight of such extravagance was infuriating. The 7 Years' War, a national humiliation, if the War of Austrian Succession had tarnished Louis's reign. The 7 Years' War 1756 to 1763 destroyed it. This global conflict pitted France against Britain and Prussia in a battle for colonial dominance. From the start, French forces were outmatched. Defeats piled up on European soil and across the oceans. Most devastating was the loss of France's North American colonies Canada, Louisiana, and much of the Caribbean. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 stripped France of its empire and reduced it to a second-rate power. The humiliation was profound. Once the terror of Europe, France was now mocked and diminished. The people did not forget who bore responsibility. Louis XV, the collapse of trust. The disasters of the 7 Years' War completed the king's transformation from the well-beloved to the hated. Far from embodying hope, Louis now symbolized decline. His court, rife with mistresses and favorites, seemed disconnected from reality. The financial costs were staggering. Taxes grew heavier, falling hardest on the poor, while nobles and clergy remained exempt. Efforts at reform failed, blocked by privilege and the king's lack of will. The gulf between Versailles and the people of France widened into a chasm. In Paris and the provinces, songs and pamphlets mocked the king as weak, corrupt, and obsessed with pleasure. The monarchy's sacred aura was fading, a waning light by the 1760s. Louis XV had withdrawn further into a private world of hunting, mistresses, and ceremony. The nation he ruled was restless, burdened with debt, humiliated abroad, and hungry at home. The king, who had once been celebrated in art and literature, was now derided in satire. His reputation, once glowing, had rotted into a symbol of all that was wrong with the monarchy. The cracks in the old order were spreading. The Enlightenment was flourishing, offering new ideas of liberty, reason, and reform. In contrast, Louis XV seemed a relicant, outdated monarch clinging to privilege, while his kingdom slipped toward catastrophe. And yet, the worst was still to come, for the king's final years would bring not just political decay, but personal horror. His death in 1774 would shock Europe and leave a stench, both literal and symbolic, that no perfume of Versailles could ever disguise. By the 1770s, the reign of Louis XV had already become a cautionary tale. The boy king, once adored as the bee name, was now despised, whispered about in taverns, mocked in pamphlets, and cursed by his own subjects. But history would not allow him to fade quietly into obscurity. His end would be a grotesque spectacle, an unforgettable image of monarchy collapsing in on itself. The final years of his life were a bitter reflection of his reign. Pleasure, pursued at the expense of duty, secrecy replacing dignity, and corruption eating away at the body of France, just as disease consumed the body of her king. When smallpox came for him in 1774, it did not merely take his life. It delivered a message to all of Europe. This monarchy was already rotting from within, a private world of decadence following the humiliation of the 7 Years' War. Louis XV retreated further into private pleasures. Madame de Pompadour had died in 1764, but her place was soon filled by another influential mistress, Madame du Barry. She was not of noble birth, but rather a courtesan, elevated suddenly to the status of royal favorite. Her presence at court outraged the nobility, who despised her origins, but the king insisted. The relationship symbolized the total disconnect between Versailles and reality. While peasants starved and France bled money, the king spent his time in secret apartments within Versailles, pursuing affairs with young women procured for him by his courtiers. The infamous Parc aux Cerfs, a kind of hidden harem became the whispered scandal of Europe. For the people, Louis was no longer simply negligent. He was morally corrupt. The sacred aura of monarchy, once preserved by the Sun King's discipline, was gone. What remained was decadence without dignity, the rise of enlightenment, opposition at the same time. France was undergoing a profound intellectual transformation. The Enlightenment was flourishing. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau challenged traditional authority, religion, and monarchy itself. Their works, smuggled into France despite censorship, found eager readers. Criticism of the king was no longer whispered in secret, but discussed in salons and cafes. Louis XV, with his mistresses and failures, became the perfect symbol of everything the Enlightenment opposed: arbitrary rule, inherited privilege, and hypocrisy. The Parliament of Paris, France's highest court, clashed repeatedly with the crown, resisting royal edicts on taxation and reform. Each conflict further eroded the king's authority. Even the nobility, once the monarchy's strongest allies, grew restless, defending their privileges while undermining the very system that upheld them by the early 1770s. Louis XV was a king without allies, a monarch without majesty. The fatal illness in April 1774, while staying at his beloved palace of Versailles, Louis XV began to feel unwell. At first, it seemed to be nothing more than a cold, but soon, fever and rashes spread across his body. Doctors quickly realized the truth. The king had contracted smallpox, one of the most feared diseases of the age. The irony was brutal. Louis had lost his parents to smallpox as a child. Now the same disease would claim him, in a far more grotesque fashion. As the illness progressed, his once handsome face swelled, blistered, and turned purple. Pustules covered his body, filling his bedchamber with the sickly stench of decay. Courtiers who had once crowded to bask in royal favor now kept their distance. Fear spread that the disease might infect anyone who came too close. Versailles, once the glittering symbol of royal power, became a chamber of horror. Servants gagged at the smell. Nobles who had fawned over him now abandoned his bedside. The king was left to rot in his own palace. The last days as death closed in, Louis XV wavered between fear and resignation. Priests urged him to repent, to distance himself from his sins and mistresses. Madame du Barry was sent away from court in disgrace, weeping as she left Versailles. But it was too late to restore dignity. The people outside Versailles whispered that divine judgment had arrived. The king, who had indulged in pleasures while neglecting his duty, was now paying the price. Pamphlets gleefully described his disease as punishment from God. On May 10, 1774, after days of agony, Louis XV finally died. He was 64 years old, having reigned for nearly 59 years longer than almost any monarch in history, but far shorter than his great-grandfather, the Sun King. What followed would be remembered as one of the most disgraceful royal funerals in history. The stench of a king's smallpox did not simply kill Louis XV, it destroyed his corpse. Within hours of death, his body began to decompose at an unnatural speed. The foul odor was so overwhelming that even the priests recoiled. Guards fainted from the stench. Tradition demanded that the king's body be laid in state, displayed in majesty for the people to mourn. But Louis XV's remains were too revolting to show. Instead, his coffin was sealed almost immediately, wrapped in quicklime to control the decay. When the funeral procession began, it was not greeted with mourning, but with indifference, even laughter. Parisians who once wept for Louis XIV now jeered as his great-grandson's coffin passed by. "Good riddance," some shouted. For the first time in centuries, the death of a king was not a national tragedy, but a relief. The man once called the well-beloved was buried as the hated, the heir, a new hope, a greater doom upon Louis XV's death. The crown passed to his grandson, Louis XVI, at just 20 years old. He was timid, indecisive, and ill-prepared. Yet at first, the people celebrated him. Compared to his loathed grandfather, Louis XVI seemed a fresh start, but the problems Louis XV had left behind were insurmountable. France was drowning in debt, its empire shattered, its institutions corrupted, and its people restless. The Enlightenment had unleashed ideas that could not be silenced. Within 15 years of Louis XV's death, these forces would explode into the French Revolution. The monarchy itself would be swept away, and the guillotine would claim his grandson's head. The rot that began under Louis XV had spread too deeply to be cut out. The symbolism of decay. Historians often speak of Louis XV's physical death as a metaphor for the monarchy's collapse. His smallpox-ravaged corpse, abandoned by friends and courtiers, sealed away in haste to hide the stench, mirrored the institution of kingship itself, diseased, rotting, and despised. Where Louis XIV had died surrounded by grandeur, with the nation mourning its loss, Louis XV's death exposed monarchy's vulnerability. Absolute power without responsibility had produced not majesty but corruption. The king's personal indulgence had become the kingdom's curse. The revolution did not begin in 1774, but in many ways, Louis XV's death was its prologue. The sight-and smell of a rotting king lingered in the French imagination. It told the people, more clearly than any philosopher's pen, that their monarchy was dying. Legacy of the hated king. What, then, is Louis XV's legacy? He inherited the most powerful throne in Europe, adored by his subjects, gifted with intelligence, wealth, and opportunity. And yet, through indecision, corruption, and indulgence, he squandered it all. His reign left France humiliated abroad, bankrupt at home, and deeply divided. His mistresses and scandals eroded respect for monarchy. His failures in war stripped France of empire. His refusal to reform left a system so fragile that his grandson could not save it. In life, he abandoned his people. In death, his people abandoned him. The transformation from the well-beloved to the hated was complete, and in that transformation lies a warning echoed through history. Power without purpose, privilege without responsibility, and pleasure without restraint will always end in rot. Louis XV's corpse may have been buried in the Basilica of Saint Denis, but his decay lingered. It haunted France as the revolution gathered force, whispering from the shadows of Versailles, "The king is dead, and the monarchy is dying with him."